Greetings, class. I wanted to take just a little bit of your time to discuss the readings for this week. Now, there is a lot of valuable information across the readings, but I do think that you will find some of the content a review for you. So at this point, most of us have settled on a topic area for the project, and we're fine-tuning our PICO questions. With the literature that you have in front of you thus far, you should be able to use that to construct the introduction, the background, the purpose, and the problem statement. You will also use the literature that you have as well as future literature to write your literature review. Remember that the literature review provides an overview of the current knowledge and shows how your project addresses the gap in clinical practice. Before you can write your literature review, you'll need to draw a conclusion about the literature because we know that not all studies, or rather all studies, have flaws. It is a good idea to be a skeptic when you're reading through research reports because we don't want to implement a change in practice that is not supported by rigorous research. It is important for everyone to recognize the value of doing a critical appraisal so that we don't implement, again, practices at the bedside that don't have sound research behind them. In essence, what you'll be doing when you do a critical analysis of the literature is you'll be making a judgment about the study's evidence. And again, you accomplish this through a critical evaluation of the strengths and weaknesses of the study. You will ask yourself questions such as, was the sample size adequate? Did the authors do a power analysis? You'll ask yourself questions, for example, if the instrument that was used to measure the study outcomes, had it been used before in this population? What is the reliability and validity of the tool? You'll ask yourself about the sampling method and whether it was most appropriate. Would another sampling strategy have been more appropriate for the question under review? We cannot take studies at face value. We must complete a critical appraisal for each article to decide whether or not the findings are reliable. And once we know that indeed they are, and that the research behind the findings are supported through sound research, then we can use that literature within our literature review. When you begin this critical appraisal, what I would recommend is that you read through the article several times for an understanding of the article, and then it's helpful to write in the margins and to circle things that stand out to you. For example, let's say, for example, the study author said there were 100 participants. Well, 100 participants sounds like a good number, but may not necessarily be so depending on the variables under review. So I would ask myself, and I would look to see whether or not the author reported that a power analysis was conducted. In order for our results to be reliable, oftentimes we need to have a minimum number of participants. And again, this is dependent on number of variables, the test that is being looked at, etc. Now, there are guidelines in the text for you to consider when doing a critical appraisal. There are general critique questions to ask relative to the literature that you have collected. There are also critique guidelines that are specific to certain designs. So, for example, if it was a cohort study, if it was a randomized controlled trial. So you may want to take a look at those guidelines specific to the type of designs that you are seeing across your literature. This week in discussion, you'll be asked to complete a critical appraisal of 2 studies. You will want to carefully review the guidelines in your textbook. I don't want you to simply answer the questions with a yes or a no. Instead, I would like to see more analysis. For example, I know that in research, when you're using an instrument to measure an outcome, that it's important that the instrument or tool have some research behind it. So consider whether or not this was the first time that the instrument had been used in this population. If so, that would set off an alarm for me. Also, if it had only been previously used maybe across children. So with instruments, it's also important to pay attention to reliability and validity. So is that information shared, and is the data uh, significant? If the reliability and validity, if those are not discussed relative to a tool, then definitely this would be considered a study weakness. I think it's important at this point that you're able to differentiate between type 1 and type 2 errors and how we minimize the risk of either. I think it's also important that you're able to differentiate between validity and reliability and to understand the significance of both. Finally, that you understand threats to reliability and validity and that you understand common statistical errors. Very important that you understand the hierarchy of evidence. Take a close look at the hierarchy of evidence because when we're writing our literature review, again, we're not going to include every study in the literature review. We only want to include those studies within the literature review that are of the highest quality. Now, oftentimes, those are the studies that are higher in the hierarchy of evidence. But again, not necessarily so, perhaps, if the sample size was low. And that's why we ask that you do a critical appraisal of the articles that you're including in your literature review to make sure that, again, you are using those ones of highest quality. When we construct the literature review, it's about quality over quantity. So again, we do not need to include every study in the literature review. If it was a study with a small sample size, we can probably put that aside and just integrate the articles into the review for those studies that included larger sample sizes. Okay. For discussion, as you're providing feedback to your peers, please, I encourage you to draw on new information from the textbook because, again, there is so much across the readings and we can't possibly cover it all without each of us pulling something from one of those chapters that we believe is significant. We will talk more about the literature review as we move forward, but the literature review will have content areas or topics that surround your PICO question. Remember, at the end of the course, you'll have a draft of Chapter 1, but recognize that it is in Nursing 790 that you will complete your literature review and send it off to your committee. So right now, we are at the point where we are continuing to collect literature relative to your study topic. We're going to start taking a closer look at some of that literature while continuing our search and looking at those articles that are most reliable. And in order to do so, we need to look at the critical appraisal process. If you have any questions or concerns, please do not hesitate to reach out to me. Thank you.